You're listening to part 2 of an interview with the first place winner of the Catholic University Center for Human Rights annual Human Rights Essay Contest by William Saunders, Director of the Center for Human Rights. To read the award-winning essays, go to humanrights.catholic.edu.
Okay, so we got a sense of how terrible the situation is. So what should Americans do about it?
Absolutely. So my paper, I kind of, talked about what Americans do from both sides, the American people, but also the American government. And so I think just, for both the American government and the American people, we first must identify the threat, the threat is the CCP and its totalitarian rule. The CCP and its totalitarian rule threatens both the Uyghurs and Americans. And we really see that the sort of the national security implications of the CCP's actions within its own borders, but also externally and abroad. In the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, the APEC summit last November, we saw that you had CCP sponsored people attacking dissidents on American soil, and these dissidents were pro-democracy or pro-human rights dissidents who were taking to the streets, and they were exercising their rights as Americans. And so that's something that's very, very shocking, I think, and that's sort of the first point I'd like to make.
I just add to that, Peter, because that's important, very important point. Is that again, if you listen to the podcast, you've heard many examples where we've discussed things like what Peter just mentioned, and other threats that the CCP is doing in America to American institutions. It's not just a threat to the Uyghur people or to the Chinese people. It is a threat to, as Guangcheng says, democracy and freedom and universal values here in the U.S. Okay, go ahead.
Of course. Thank you. Very good points. And I think for more focusing on what American people can do is as Americans, we should really reflect on the values of our Declaration of Independence. One of the foundational documents of our country. The values of equality, freedom, and unalienable rights granted by God. If we really believe that human rights are self-evident and universal, we should also recognize the importance of safeguarding the rights of the Uyghurs. I think that's a very important point. I also think, though, on the narrative battlefield, the CCP is very effective in their united front work and their political work and really taking control of the narrative. And so I think as Americans, we should really, fight the CCP's odious narrative that, Chinese values are not conducive to respecting human rights. I mean, I think, one key example, that the counterexample to the CCP's narrative was, one of the key architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was Chinese statesman PC Chang or Zhang Pengchun. And he introduced Confucian values into this document.
Yeah, I
And
want to emphasize that that is an excellent point. As listeners may know, so I have a program in human rights at Catholic University, and that program, in some ways, is founded on Catholic teaching about human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And an easy way to think about it is the great Pope John Paul II, who is in his first encyclical. He talked about various things, but he talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, as Peter is saying, it's universal, which means it's not a quote Western or American statement of rights. It was a statement that the world agreed to because it was arrived at by surveying across cultures. It wasn't just some professors from the West who went in a room and wrote this. It was based on a survey across cultures, and one of the cultures was the Chinese culture and the Confucian culture. And so I think you're right to use the word odious narrative because human rights are universal, and the Chinese Communist Party is trying to pretend there's a difference. Maybe there's special, that I mean, anyway, it's complicated, but they pretend that they've done so much politically and economically to and help the Chinese people, and so they don't need political rights or civil rights, and they try to break them apart. But it's all malarkey, and the Universal Declaration refutes it. And the role of Chinese scholar and the cross-cultural just analysis that went into putting it together refutes it. So I think that's very important. And I think Americans, citizens, need to realize that. We're not imposing anything by insisting that the Uyghur people be treated with dignity and respect. That is a universal human right that is fully consistent with Chinese culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think I interrupted you, Peter. What else should Americans do?
No worries, no worries. This is more focusing on what the government has and what the government can do. So the U.S. government has an extensive toolkit, and it should also use it, right? There's already in place. There's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which basically bans goods produced with forced labor. It has this mechanism called the rebuttable presumption, which shifts the burden on importers to prove that their goods have not been tainted with Uyghur forced labor. Recently, actually, the DHS just came out and said that it had added a few more entities and companies to its sanctioned entities list, and this involved companies within the seafood packaging industry. So that is a sign of progress right there. But I do think though that greater enforcement is needed. And one thing I wrote in my paper was that and this kind of goes in line with my central argument about the double persecution, sort of the double persecution nature of the genocide, which is to also implement both the Women, Peace and Security Act of 2017 and the International Religious Freedom Act, IRFA, of 1998. And such coordinated effort would promote peace building and also the safeguarding religious freedom abroad, and also the meaningful participation of Uyghur women in telling their stories. So,
Yeah, that would be interesting to record, just to document and archive and to then get into the media and to the awareness of the American people and all the people around the world, but if we're talking about Americans, of what's going on, because the old saying that evil thrives in darkness is correct. You shine a light in a corner and you see, the roaches and the rats have to run away. And that's what we're trying to do, would be trying to do with that project.
absolutely.
And the other thing I want to mention, Peter, is, some of these, you mentioned several laws, and people, if they don't know them, again, they can read your essay and get the correct name and all that stuff and look it up. But the point is, if you're an American citizen, you can tell your legislator, you can tell your state legislator, and you can tell your congressman or your senator that you're concerned about this issue, because that's the way democracy works. Uh, if you're listening to this podcast and you think you're powerless to do anything, you are completely wrong, because nothing's going to get done unless you care enough about it to tell your representatives who do exercise the political power that this is something they should address. So, if you kind of think, well, I can't do anything, write a letter. That's a big deal. I live in Washington, D.C., where I've been my whole career, and I can tell you it makes a big difference. Any other thoughts,
Absolutely.
Peter?
Yeah, I think just to, another thought is just, I think like you said, we should keep talking about this. Really to shine a light on the CCP's human rights abuses, and to make sure that this is not forgotten in history. Because I think, forgetting or amnesia is really something that is very scary just to forget. So yeah.
Yeah, I just again, that's a great point, because I want to just emphasize again for the people listening. The reason we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is because the whole wide world gathered at the UN following what happened in the Second World War, which was the greatest atrocities in the history of the human race. More innocent people killed and done in very vicious ways. Said the only way to have peace in the world is to respect human rights. So that means, as Peter's saying, we're not just concerned about what happened in the past. We're concerned about what's happening right now, and it can be directed against any group. And we have to learn that in the past we did not pay enough attention to it. It resulted in the Second World War. Again, read the UN Charter, read the Universal Declaration. The world concluded that disrespect of human rights resulted in the Second World War, which is the most devastating in history. And the world concluded we must respect human rights to prevent a third world war and the end of the human race. So we're all in it together. And we can't shut our eyes to atrocities that happen outside our borders.
That's right. That's right. And I think especially, after the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide, we said never again. And I think, evidence for genocide is once again conclusive. And so we have to make sure that never again is not just a slogan. Actions speak louder than words.
Yeah, very good, Peter. Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us.
Dr. Saunders,
I hope
this.
people listening will circulate this through your social networks. So we invite you to come back and join us on the next podcast. And I want to again thank Peter for being with us and writing this excellent essay, that CCP's Genocide Against the Uyghurs, Why Americans Should Care.
The Catholic University of America's Center for Human Rights has published a documentary on the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The documentary features world-class human rights experts, from former State Department officials to ambassadors and human rights activists. It can be found on our website at humanrights.catholic.edu.